Judge Guzman is conducting an ongoing criminal investigation into what is essentially a vast criminal conspiracy in which, as he noted, some of those who are implicated and indeed indicted, because he's indicted them, are in power. And Peter mentioned and Ted reiterated this comment about the truth shall set you free and being inscribed at the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. I would be remiss at this institution if I didn't point out that it was Jesus Christ who actually said that and had some very clear statements about where the truth was to be found. Last night we saw Romero, and we shouldn't forget that here at the Romero Award it is, as important it is to hear from the recipient, the real purpose of the Romero Award indeed is to commemorate the life and ministry and martyrdom of Romero, and he too was one whose pursuit of truth and justice was rooted actually in the gospel. Not sure that if he read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, he had the gospel, and that was probably all he needed. And a final point, Genesis to me, Ted pointed out that these crimes are not new. Genesis tells the story of the very first homicide, and of course it is the very first disappearance. Cain kills Abel and disappears him. And God asks Cain, where's your brother? Because his blood cries to me from the earth. It was a disappearance case. This is as old as time, as is really our moral obligation to do something about it. With that, questions, please.
Missionary in South America and Chile from 1991 and died accidentally here in 1990. Who was very close to Cardinal Silva. And I read part of your book or skimmed it the last time I went to Chile. And I noticed Cardinal Silva was mentioned many times and he's worked with the poor. My brother also worked with the poor in Creel. He was in Rio Negro at the beginning of his assignment there and then moved to Santiago, Chile. When you spoke about respecting responsibility to the memory, I found that when I went down to Chile 3 times that as a North American, that because I was by Hermana de Padre Lorenzo, I was given special treatment. And I believe that most of the people there, when we went to a restaurant the last time, when they announced us our table as visitors in North America, we received no applause. Canadians did, you know, the people from Europe did. And I often wonder, is that changed any down there, their attitude towards North Americans, and do they still feel that we are not helping the progress of their country? Because when my brother was there, he was also knew some of the political aspects of the North American politics, United States specifically what they were doing, and obviously was not telling us much. We found out much, much more after he died because most of his mail was already open before we received it, and our mail to him the same. So I just wonder, do the majority of the people feel that the people from the United States are not with them in their progress in changing and revealing the history of what had happened in Chile? And I guess I have a million questions. That's probably I have no.
Well, I am very sorry of how some people reacted to you. I will try to give you a feeling of what an ordinary person of any country feels, for example, in front of any situation. And then that person gives it a total thought, and you think that because one person or a government or a group of people are that way or stand for certain politics, that the whole country stands for the same politics also. I will tell you my sin. I was invited to Cuba a few months ago, and I did not want to go because Fidel Castro is its president, and human rights are not respected there. Well, afterwards, I realized that I was accusing every Cuban of violations of human rights. I think that in Chile there is a sort of resentfulness. I don't know whether that's the right word. Certain Chileans are resentful about the intervention of United States before the coup. That could be one of the reasons. Another reason is that many people of our country think that is because of the multinationals and Coca-Cola and Blue Jeans, Wranglers and Chrysler, etc., that there is poverty in the Latin American countries that are sending their raw materials and that come back to the country with a price that the normal people cannot pay. There is also the concept of an old picture. I don't remember. Most of you are very young here. I would say 10 of us would remember that picture. The Ugly American. I don't know whether you, the young, remember it or have seen it. Well, this has to do with an attitude of superiority and of some people from United States. But at the same time, it's the superiority of any person that comes from a country that has a higher way of living. And as the people that we see mostly in Chile that come from abroad are from the United States, then we only perceive their apparent superiority through their acts. But it's the same superiority that people from Sweden or from Germany or from France or from many other countries that are much more developed in their economies than we are. I don't know. I have heard and I have seen that hostility you speak about, but I think it's absolutely just a way of showing sometimes people's impotence. I do not think that in Chile people from the United States are despised, hated, and by the other hand, or on the other hand, it is true. We receive lots of help in many aspects, and those forms of help sometimes are not shown in the right way, and that too may make people resentful. But in 2 words, I think that this is very bad to say. I think that Chile has become a resentful country. In a moment, it was an open country where all foreigners that came to Chile were admired, wanted to be copied. I mean, the Chileans wanted to copy them in their way of thinking and the ideas they brought and all. And today, after so many years of of suffering and of being silent and of being suspicious, then we have become a very gray and not a hospitable country. So I'm really sorry for what has happened to you, and I think you do not deserve it, unless, much less, being the sister of somebody that did so good and that died for Chile.
Just an observation and also a question. For our poet, I was very struck by your comments. I hear them with an ear of someone who celebrates the liturgy and understands the representation and activation of the past for the present. And there were so many things you said that I could have put in a page in a book on the theology of the liturgy. You may know all of that, but it was really striking to hear the way you put it. I believe it was George Orwell who wrote once that those who control the present control the past, and those who know the past shape the future. And so I think memory is absolutely crucial. Without it, there's amnesia. My question goes to the judge, and that is, you mentioned something I would like if you could speak a little more about, and that is the role that the church has played in assisting the truth to come forward.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your question. The church was absolutely divided, as it was divided in El Salvador. In the picture we saw yesterday about Monsignor Oscar Romero. There were conservative, very conservative priests, and I'll give you an example, that they read the list of the people that have died in the Mercurio. That's the most important newspaper in Chile. And I did a trip with this priest coming from Spain together. And I asked him, could you pass me the newspaper to see the people that have died lately? There was a list of about 80 people that had died. And he said, no, there's nobody that died. That means there's nobody of the people he respects that has died. Well, there were, and there continue to be priests like that. Nobody died. Well, in Chile, we had the impression that Monsignor Silva Enriquez, that was our cardinal during the worst years, we had the impression that he was a conservative priest. He belonged to a very important and wealthy family in Talca, 250 kilometers south of Santiago, in the best schools, in the best seminaries, and so on. And finally, there was a moment where nobody dared to move a finger in Chile after the coup of 1973. And as people began to disappear, Monsignor Silva Enriquez started to have reunions with the vicars and with the bishops of most of the country, or let us say of all of the country, and made the vicars and the bishops make lists of the disappeared. And with those lists, he started to fight. He started to make other people fight, struggle, priests, lawyers. He moved the relatives of the disappeared and of the tortured and of the detained. And he did it with extraordinary heroism. Everybody started to call him communist, the red bishop or the red cardinal, the devilish cardinal, the devil. The people in Santiago, most of the people that were for the militaries, for the soldiers, didn't say hello to him, didn't even, if he started a speech in the cathedral, would go out. But this despise that he received from everybody made him extremely strong. Using an expression that Mark told me about, speaking about a priest here in this university, if Cardinal Silva came into a room, everybody experienced something in his inside. It was like the presence of God. And well, most of the priests that struggled against the dictatorship were called red bishops or communists, and the same conversation of ordinary people always finished with the idea that the church was divided by the communist bishops and those who were not. And those who were not were precisely the priests that didn't do anything at all. I think that forgive my verbs, there are certain verbs that I cannot arrive to say. Yo creo que si no hubiera sido por la iglesia,
If it had not been for the church.
If it had not been for the church in Chile, we wouldn't have only, please forgive me for saying only if it's related to people that have suffered, we wouldn't only have around 3,000 people killed or around 1,000 people missing. I think it would have been much, much worse.
Dave.
Thank you so much for your presence here.
Thank you.
This is great for all of us. Shortly after the Valech report came out, in which the victims of torture were able to come forward and speak about the personal tragedy, I saw an article in La Prensa Austral from Punta Arenas that indicated that only 20% of possible torture victims came forward. Is that an accurate number for the rest of Chile, for Santiago as well, that only a fifth of the people came forward who were actually tortured, who had this opportunity to speak?
Well, to tell you the truth, it is possible, because the people that have been tortured don't want to look back. I've spoken with many of them. I've encouraged them to present complaints. I'm sorry, and they don't want to. Most of them really do not want to remember what happened to them. Most of the tortures have to do with the most private parts of the human body, and then it's suffering twice. It's being tortured twice to tell what really happened to them. It could be true, but according to the Valech Inform, there have been over 28,000 people that have been tortured and recognized that they have been tortured, and there are and there's lots of credibility that those people were tortured. There is a saying in Chile that the people that were really tortured are around 300,000 people. Not sometimes directly, but indirectly. the torture of phoning and saying, look, your husband continues in life, being alive. If you collaborate, perhaps he will maintain himself alive for a few days more. I mean, there has been lots of psychological torture also, and secondary torture. That's the suffering that have the people whose relatives are in jail or disappeared or are being tortured. Well, I think the concept of this type of secondary torture has not been really investigated.
And the president at the time, when I was in Chile in November, there is not a very good feeling about Henry Kissinger now. Yeah. And I guess what I'm asking is, we even hints that there are people in Chile that want to bring legal action against Henry Kissinger. I'd just like you to comment on the status of that. Did what, and this is where the lawyers would come in, did Henry Kissinger, to the best of our knowledge, ever do anything illegal? If so, what's so, and if so, what's the sort of status? Is there a case?
Because of the work of Judge Guzman, who actually sent a legal set of papers to Henry Kissinger's office demanding that he answer questions in the case of Charles Horman several years ago, and because of the work of Judge Garzón in Spain to try and extradite Augusto Pinochet from London to Spain, a new verb entered the lexicon of human rights work: to be Pinocheted. And the one U.S. official or former official who has experienced this phenomena is Henry Kissinger. He has been Pinocheted. He cannot go to certain countries without facing a judge like Judge Guzman saying, there are questions you need to answer. He was in France and Paris a couple of years ago, and a magistrate came to his hotel and served him with papers to depose him on cases of French Chileans who had been disappeared. He immediately left the country. He was supposed to receive a prestigious award 2 years ago in Rio, in Brazil, from the president, actually. And word got out that he was coming, and a number of groups said that they wanted to question him on Operation Condor. They made up some excuse, and he canceled his visit. So certainly the issue of universal jurisdiction, the issue of his contribution to some of the crimes, whether it's a direct or tacit type of contribution, has haunted the recent phase of his life. Now, there actually was a case that was brought against him by the family of a slain Chilean general named Rene Schneider, who was murdered in October of 1970. His murder was part of a coup plot that the CIA had organized to try and prevent Salvador Allende from actually being inaugurated. And because General Schneider was the commander-in-chief of the army and therefore could give orders to the army to put down any coup activities, he needed to be neutralized, as the U.S. declassified documents say. And the CIA passed $50,000 to a group of coup plotters to pay some thugs to kidnap General Schneider, and his kidnapping would be then blamed on Salvador Allende's forces. He would be replaced by a pro-coup general. They would sweep through Allende's strongholds and arrest everybody. And this was the coup that the CIA signed on to. And the CIA officials say that they briefed Henry Kissinger on this plot. And it got very, very murky. Instead of kidnapping him, he was killed. And his family, many years later, when these documents were declassified, looked at the documents, which included one, by the way, in which the CIA sent a letter of congratulations from the headquarters at Langley to the CIA station Santiago after Schneider was shot, saying, congratulations, you've brought Chile to the point where a coup is possible. You're to be commended for this hard and difficult work at this difficult time. That was the official CIA response. Of course, we didn't know about it because the document was top secret until it was declassified 4 years ago to this killing. And this is the case that was brought against Kissinger. It was a civil suit for wrongful death. It was heard in court, in the appeals court, the appellate court in Washington two Fridays ago. But it turns out that just as Augusto Pinochet claimed in London that he had sovereign immunity as a head of state, Kissinger has said that he can't be charged with wrongful death for any activities that were undertaken, quote, within the scope of his employment, unquote. And the judges have so far ruled that that is, in fact, his protection for him, and that even if it could be shown that he was directly complicit with this political murder, he would be protected under U.S. law. And so that case it has been dismissed. It's under appeal, and we'll know in another 9 or 10 months about what the final ruling is. In Pinochet's case, we may well have a courtroom verdict. In Kissinger's case, I would predict we're just going to have to live with the verdict of history.
Mark, can I make a comment? I'm not going to comment on Kissinger, but there is a disturbing trend that as Americans, we need to be conscious of and need to be aware of. This whole question of general jurisdiction, this whole concept of universal jurisdiction. This country brought about the Nuremberg trials. This country brought about the International Military Tribunal in the Far East. This country called for the international criminal tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. We have a long history of committing ourselves to the rule of law to deal with questions of violations of human rights, crimes against humanity, and the like. If you study human rights, you know the importance of Phil Artiga v. Peña-Urala, where the United States courts held a torturer guilty of a tort here in the United States for an act that took place in Uruguay. Judge Kaufman, in a tremendous decision, discussed how torture is a universal issue and that no one should be free from trial who is a torturer. This whole idea of universal jurisdiction is central to, as Bert has suggested, to our commitment to the rule of law. And we are now seeing a trend in this country that's frightening. As a lawyer and as a teacher and as an advocate of human rights, the withdrawal from the Treaty of Rome, the ICC, just recently the rejection of the International Court of Justice decision regarding individuals who are exposed to the death penalty and were not able to see their counselors under a consular treaty, and our withdrawal from a jurisdiction to the ICJ. This is a terrible threat. I mean, if Judge Guzman's lesson is that the rule of law is essential to deter crime, to rid us of the evils of the past, to bring reconciliation, we need to reassess our American policy as to which direction are we going. Abu Ghraib has become the icon of the 21st century. The picture that was in Newsweek, we all recognize it. We thought it was going for the while and still remains. We think of the World Trade Center, but now it is shared on the icon list, the picture of the tortured victim in Abu Ghraib. I think as citizens of the world, as Americans, we have an obligation to right our country back to our commitment of the rule of law. Long before the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine said in Common Sense that if America needs a king, the king needs to be the law, and the law needs to serve the interest of the people. That includes the universal principles that we've been arguing internationally. We need the Guzmans here in America We need our citizens in America to right the ship, to bring the rule of law back as a major policy consideration. I'm sorry for that speech, but I felt that this was the moment to make it.
I think a number of us want an opportunity to respond to this. First, let me say with respect to Kissinger, I'm really surprised to hear that Henry Kissinger would have been so humble to say that he's immune from immunity for having worked for a sovereign state. I would have thought he would have said he was immune from prosecution simply for being Henry Kissinger. In my own work on Chile, in the book I wrote for Bert's series, I did not concern myself a great deal with the United States' involvement in the coup because I knew that was a field that was being cultivated by many other scholars, and Peter and others, John Dingus and others, but certainly that the involvement of the United States was critical to the coup, and the documents reveal that now, all these years later. But let me just say something in general that builds on what Ted said about Kissinger and his legacy for U.S. foreign policy. This notion that, and this is important to you as our students, this notion that in foreign policy or in international affairs, power and power alone is what matters is a very dangerous idea that I urge you to reject utterly, particularly in the time we're in. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the students who are here in a seminar that I've really been privileged to be part of. I was going to say direct, but to be part of on human rights on the war on terrorism. And I'm really encouraged by you all to, as we grapple with these issues of, yes, we must fight against a very dangerous enemy, but we must obey law in doing it. I'm really gratified to hear the students' insights into that. So what may happen to Henry Kissinger for his involvement in Chile, I don't know, but I think, as I said at dinner last night, Judge Guzman is one of those jurists now who've made the world very, very dangerous, a very, very dangerous place for tyrants and for those who aided and abetted them. And so if Henry Kissinger must modify his travel plans or think more carefully about his itinerary, more power.
Oh, okay. I'm also not going to comment so much on Kissinger, but I've been just reflecting on some of the comments of all of you in the audience, and I'd like to a little bit, and this relates to Kissinger, the idea of perhaps a sense of resentment of not so much the U.S. citizens or the people of this country, but its government. I've always believed that privilege requires responsibility, that those that have the privilege of literacy, of education, of access to knowledge should be responsible. And I think that we are seeing in this country that this is a privileged society without responsibilities. And that is extremely dangerous. And responsibilities are towards history. We speak about Henry Kissinger, we all know about his complicity with Pinochet. But if you speak to the general population of this country, history matters very little to America. And it seems that history only begins in 9/11. But what about before 9/11? So the issue of Kissinger is fundamental in the understanding of this country's complicity in the affairs of others, not only in Chile, but in East Timor, where he was so responsible, and in Central America. So I think that when we think of Kissinger, he also should become an emblematic person in the way in which, and a representative of U.S. policy towards the rest of the world, and that's why it's so dangerous to speak about him. The last remark I'd like to mention that was made about the issue of torture. I think that we must, and will be an almost utopian ideal society, create societies and create countries where it's possible to speak about torture, where the victims will be safe, because torture is about silence, and torture is about the denial of language, and it's about secrecy. And that will be the ultimate possibility, that will be the triumph of human rights, a safety to speak about what is so unspeakable, and that goes to Peter's question.
I'd also like to try to tie in just a couple themes from the Kissinger and your previous concern on the attitude toward Americans. I recall being in Berlin a week after September the 11th, 2001, and the U.S. Embassy is in the former part that was East Berlin, and about halfway down the street. And all down the street were flowers in commemoration of those who had lost their lives on September 11th, the Americans, sort of an impromptu memorial. That scene was replayed throughout the world. I mean, I think the world was absolutely surprised at the depth of feeling that they had and sympathy toward Americans, the United States. It is, if someone had told me then that it would have been possible for that sympathy to have evaporated to the level that it has today, I didn't think the Bush administration would have been able to accomplish it. But it is clear that what has occurred since then has, I mean, our respect in terms of the rest of the world is at an absolutely low point. And I would suggest it is largely because of our lack of respect for the rule of law, that a belief that somehow it applies to other countries, but that it doesn't apply to us. And this is, yes, sort of a Kissinger kind of attitude, but it's one that's been taken to almost a point of pride in this administration, where they, you know, nominating John Bolton to represent the United States before the United Nations. I mean, an individual who has campaigned against Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, because he was right about Iraq. I mean, that's essentially Bolton's campaign, who has campaigned against the United Nations. I mean, this is sort of in-your-face diplomacy, if you will, that the Bush administration seems to be taking great pleasure in. Paul Wolfowitz for the World Bank. I mean, this, as Americans, this display of arrogant indifference, where, just sort of the last part of it being where we now know apparently there were 27 people that were murdered. This is were murdered while in Afghanistan and Iraq while imprisoned by American forces. And it appears from at least an article in the New York Times a couple days ago that a decision has been made that no higher-ups are going to be held responsible. I mean, we have become an international outlaw, where somehow a belief is that because of our greatness, I guess, that laws should not constrain us, well, they should constrain others. And this clearly is something which, as Americans, we should be greatly concerned of, and that, yes, I think it explains in part why when one travels to other countries that you may want to indicate that you're Canadian. So.
Mark, just before you take that question, can I just finish with Kissinger by showing you a picture that's worth 1,000 words?
Kissinger and Pinochet.
I hope you can see it. Kissinger and Pinochet, June of 1976 in Santiago. The smiles are gone now. That's the one thing we can say.
Do you have the Rumsfeld Saddam Hussein picture with you as well? Dr. Carnes.
I would like to pose a question and invite any or all of the panelists to respond briefly. Back to Chile and to the search for truth and justice, if not reconciliation. And my question is, in a process like this, there are often surprises. Judge Guzman referred to the fact of seeking a legal truth. Understanding of what had happened was there, but the legal truth was what was sought. But one often, nonetheless, still finds surprises. And I would ask you, within the bounds of what you are free and comfortable talking about, as well as each of the other panelists, to comment briefly on what has surprised you as this process of the search for truth and the effort to bring Pinochet and others to justice has gone forward in recent years.
Can I suggest, and it's an excellent question and it's addressed to several of us, can I suggest that Juan address that last? This will be the last question and we can end on that note. So if others will take that and we'll have it culminate with Juan's response to that. Surprises. Peter, Marjorie?
Well, thank you, Margaret. I think that maybe Ted and all of us would agree with this. I think that what has surprised me is the hope, the possibility that the judging, that the pursuit of accountability, that the pursuit of truth allows us to dream, to use Eleanor Roosevelt's line, to dream another world and to imagine another world. And in an age, and especially the students in this room, in a century of so much cynicism and disempowerment, and believe that revolutions are not possible, I think hope is the possibility to dream that change and revolutions, peaceful revolutions, are possible. And it also allows us to believe that hope is also a state of mind, that no matter what happens around us and the histories that surround us, one could believe that hope is achievable within our own selves.
Mark, if I could. I won't speak of Chilean surprises, but I will speak of Albania and say, and I wouldn't call it a surprise. I thought at the time it would be an inevitability, and it turned out to be an inevitability. When Milosevic was put on the dock and Albanians gathered in Kosovo and Albania in coffee shops everywhere to watch this process, there was glee, there was exhilaration. The Albanians who were forced to leave their homes, who had lost their families, were exhilarated over the fact that the victimizer would be brought to justice. Only this last month, the acting prime minister of the interim government in Kosovo, who was a military figure in the war with the Kosovo Liberation Army, was indicted. He's now in the dock. That's what the rule of law is about. That the victims can seek, not revenge, and I think we have to be very careful. It's not seeking retribution. We haven't brought that word up today, but it's not getting your pound of flesh. Lustration, cleansing, it too has negative connotations. But it's something, and I think our poet has expressed it, it's something important in our human soul that we come to and address these problems. as Oedipus finding out who the real murderer was and finding out that he was himself was a very important lesson. If we start exploring who the murderers are, maybe we will look to ourselves.
I'll pass this microphone to Judge Guzman, but I'd just say that I'll always remember where I was, you know, on October 16th, 1998, when Augusto Pinochet was arrested in London. I think almost for my generation, it's like remembering where you were when Kennedy was shot. I mean, it was, for the human rights community, that was an unparalleled surprise and stunning and shocking and exhilarating all at once. And then we'll remember, and I must say I was stunned and surprised when 3 days after Pinochet returned to Chile, amidst the pomp and circumstance that he was offered by the Chilean military in March of 2000, I guess it was, Judge Guzman indicted him, moved to have him stripped of his immunity in his own country, which was it was an extraordinary thing. Pinochet arrived, the military threw out the red carpet, there was a band playing. I'm sure some of you saw the images of him rising out of his wheelchair like the Phoenix and walking across the tarmac when everybody had been led to believe he was a cripple. And, you know, and that statement by the military was, "Mi general, nada ha cambiado en este país." Nothing has changed in this country, welcome back. And then within 72 hours, I'm proud to say the man sitting next to me made a different statement that something really had changed while Pinochet was away. And now prosecuting him was actually possible. And that was a stunning surprise also. And I have to say, I was surprised again just last January, just in January, when Manuel Contreras, the head of the Chilean secret police and the person besides Pinochet most responsible for these atrocities, was literally hauled off to prison. He pulled a gun on the guards that came to get him. He refused to voluntarily surrender. He was pelted with fruit and eggs by Chileans as he left the tribunal, which of course the military found very offensive. But I think most of us could understand at this point. Those are, I think, some of the surprises. At some point we could discuss the great surprises in the declassified documents, but the one thing that is not surprising is that after more than 30 years, so many Chileans, enough Chileans, let's put it that way, refused to forget, refused to put this in the past, and continued to demand the healing and necessary process of justice all these years later. And Chile is still with us 32 years after the coup took place, and we're here still to talk about it today.
I want to just pick up on that point and then I'll ask Juan to close this session. There are many things I'm not surprised about having gone there. I'm not surprised that the pain is so deep, particularly the pain of the families that disappeared. I'm not surprised that the supporters of Pinochet, although this is a declining number, still adore him and revere him as the military messiah. I'm not surprised that politicians, although they would deny this, have strewn obstacles in Juan Guzman's path. I'm not surprised by any of that. I'm not surprised that I agree with Peter on this, that the families and the human rights movement has struggled tenaciously, that was your word, Marjorie, about poetry and memory, to achieve truth and achieve justice. That doesn't surprise me. What surprises me, and maybe this indicates my cynicism, is that the human rights movement's been effective. They've actually brought this apart. Many, many years ago, in what was a deeply moving experience for me, I interviewed Sola Sierra, whose husband, Waldo Ulises Pizarro Molina, was disappeared in 1976, and I quote her in my book. And then this last trip in November, I interviewed Sola Sierra had since passed away. I interviewed her daughter, so I had the privilege to interview the wife and now the daughter of a disappeared man, Lorena Pizarro. And I told her that I'd interviewed her mother. And she said, tell me about my mama. I mean, she knew her mother, but she wanted an outsider's commentary about her mother. And I said, well, I'm from Buffalo. Caught her off surprise. What am I talking about? I said, it's near Niagara Falls. Are you familiar with Niagara Falls? And she said, yes, it's famous. And I said, well, what always surprises me about Niagara Falls is how something as soft as water can, over time, cut a canyon into stone. And listening to your mother's voice, because Sola Sierra had this quiet but determined and powerful voice, listening, Lorena, to your mother Sola's voice reminded me of where I'm from, that water can destroy rock, that truth can defeat impunity. That's what surprises me. Not that they've kept up the struggle, but really that the struggle has been this successful.
As a judge, I'm an old judge. I've been 33 years in the bench. Well, I always write my answers. So, Doctor, you will forgive me if I will read the reasons or what has surprised us during these investigations, searching the truth, the legal truth, naturally. The legal truth for those who are not lawyers or students of law is the truth that is in the files. Sometimes the legal truth has nothing to do with the truth itself. It is very fortunate when both truths are just one truth. Well, I have, during all these years, and with the investigations that have been performing, well, I realized that the threat of the coup, a threat of a coup, if high officers or Pinochet were indicted, was an invention of the people that supported the dictatorship. Newspapers, some industrials, people that had big properties and that had produced very much during the dictatorship. Well, the soldiers in Chile didn't, after I would say, after the cases against Pinochet, didn't think 1 minute of a coup. Perhaps they hoped to think, or hoped others should think, but that was just an invention. And we realized that one indictment after the other, after the other, and after the other. The good thing was that the first person that was that Pinochet was not the first person to be indicted. So there were many officers in the way that permitted us to test what could happen if Pinochet was indicted. Another surprise was to acknowledge that the soldiers were braver in accepting their guilt than the civilians. The civilians squealed like mice. It was really disgusting. And they realize, and we all realize in our society, that the soldiers were used as they always have been used in all the dictatorships in our different countries. Normally, the remembrance of the soldiers turns to be a sad one, and they continue to be used through history. I don't know whether you say used or utilized. Used. Used. Yes, thank you. Another reality, but this is something that psychiatrists would know 1,000 times better than I, is that the defendants need a trial to deliver their bad conscience. That I have seen many soldiers, especially soldiers, officers that have come to speak to me after being interrogated and opened their heart and sometimes cried, telling me how terrible it is and was and will be for him and for his family to have committed such terrible crimes, and that they are very repentful about this. Well, that is a curious thing, because one always thinks that a judge is the bad man in the courthouse for many people. But I've seen even signs of gratitude. What is worst is to realize in these investigations that money is more important than people and that human lives. Before Pinochet's, before our knowledge of Pinochet having so many accounts in so many banks, well, he was still a very admired person. But after the moment when we saw that he had taken our money, the people's money, well, he lost, I would say, if he had some popularity, he lost most of it. This is something, a good surprise, that more Chileans respect law and order than their own interests. And there's a surprise that is no surprise to anybody. It is that politics in our country, in Chile, has more to do with possession than with ideals. That's how I could answer your questions.
Thank you all for coming. Tonight at 7:30 in Sears Recital, we will honor Judge Guzman with the Romero Award. Please attend. It should be quite moving. Thank you.
manejas el curso de los ríos, tú que sembraste